we're into change. And it change is a lot easier, I said, than one might think, right? And the change really comes from the fact that a lot of the history that we've been taught is inaccurate.
Hi, and welcome back to StudioBinder Academy. I'm Brandon. Today we're speaking with filmmakers Michele Stephenson and Joe Brewster. Michele, Joe, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Hi, happy to be here. Thank you.
Pleasure.
To start things off, we always like to get everyone's background. So Michele, how about we start with you? Is there anything that drew you to filmmaking, any films or filmmakers in particular?
I come to filmmaking as actually a what I would probably call a third career. And it's actually this other person here on the screen, Joe Brewster, that drew me to it. I mean, I'd always loved film, but never thought I could really be in a position to make film. And when I met Joe, he had basically left his lucrative, professional career to explore creative storytelling and the impact that it could have. And I was just starting law school at the time, and I got the bug through and immersed with his work.
Amazing. And Joe, how about yourself?
I had a fantasy that I was going to change the world. And instead of blowing it up, I was going to tell stories. And I think they're pretty comparable in terms of impact. Mm-hmm. But the longer story, I am from Los Angeles. My father was a preacher. His father was a preacher. They told stories. That's the way the community knew them. That's the way he had an impact on that community in central Los Angeles. And although I would not call myself a religious man, I would say I'm a storyteller. And it is part of my culture. It's part of what I was raised to do. And I'm so excited to tell stories that I want to hear, and I think I'll have an impact on the folks I grew up with.
And was there anything that kind of drew you to documentaries specifically, other than, wanting to change the world?
Changing the world is not as difficult as your question might imply, because we do it one story at a time. But no, so I train in medicine. I'm a psychiatrist.
Oh, okay.
And I would say that I just kind of felt one story at a time, 5 stories at a time, didn't impart the kind of information that I wanted to impart. And it was simple, that the community that I grew up in was more complex and deserved to be understood in all of its complexity and beauty and ugliness. And so I basically left to tell these stories. I didn't understand how stories are told, how emotionally powerful they can be, character, story structure. I learned that. But basically to be a documentary filmmaker. But then I fell into this group of narrative filmmakers in New York, and that's what I did for 10 years. The first 4 or 5 years, we basically made each other's shorts. We made anything we could do to make film, to edit, to write, we did. But I think the person who brought me to doc was Michele.
Oh, really?
Well, I come from a social justice background. I trained in international affairs, human rights law, and development work. So I was moved by the process of filmmaking, more so by documentary, because I felt that there was change happening in the process, whether it was the people we were collaborating with and the stories that we were telling. And then there was potential for change after that in terms of the impact of the film. But the fact that there was some form or some level of even small transformation happening in the one-on-one exchanges with the people we were telling the stories with and about really felt very powerful, and I could feel that. I think they're in some ways one and the same. It's sort of the same continuum in terms of the skill set that's required to be able to tell a story. Even casting, I would say, we often sort of take casting skills and figuring out, who we're going to collaborate with and in terms of the stories that we're going to tell. I find that it's a bit of a false dichotomy to sort of separate them out because they sort of feed each other. And in fact, I think we're sort of at this point coming more circle around trying to control our narratives more through fiction or through more fiction devices. But I think what propelled us into a deeper dive into documentary filmmaking was a level of independence we wanted to keep, but also the fact that, with fiction filmmaking, you need a lot more money to even get started. You can have a screenplay in your hand that can take years and years to make. But with documentary, even though the filmmaking, can take a long time, you can get in it right away. Once you know your story and know what you want to explore, the cost is not as much. And so you can be in the process much earlier. And even if it's for a long period of time, you feel like you're making stuff, So I think that allowed us to lean into documentary more for right now, almost 25 years almost. Yeah.
That's an interesting point that you make, because not a lot of people, when you talk about, narrative filmmaking, the budget is the big thing, but not a lot of people talk about the budget in documentaries. What is typically kind of the biggest budget line item in a documentary process?
For us, it's the editing. The editor, the biggest budget line item in the budget. And they get paid more consistently. You have to make sure that you have enough for them to make an impact on the film. So they have to be on for a substantial period of time. So for us, it's really the kind of the big budget breaker for us. And they're not cheap. So
I would imagine. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. You have all of that footage that you're working with, and you have to build that story kind of in the editing room.
We started out doing a fair amount of verite. The cost of that edit was huge, but now we are moving away from verite per se. We like to call what we do is stylized verite, and so we're employing more tools to tell the story. So we're using archival, we're using found footage, we're using verite, animation now and then, but we kind of feel it's overused. Once we've moved away from the verite, what we find is archival probably is as more costly.
Oh, really?
Unfortunately, we are ambitious. With our latest feature, I think I can say that still. Going to Mars and Nikki Giovanni, the cost of the archival outpaced editing, and a couple of the films that we're involved in now, they're probably going to double the editing costs. I think getting back to this notion of cost, it's pretty important. I had the freedom. Michele wanted to make a documentary, so she asked me to stop making narrative work for 5 years while she learned to be a good documentarian. And so I decided I was not going to do that. And what I would do is start shooting a film about our son growing up in a predominantly affluent white independent school in New York City. That film was American Promise. It won a jury prize at Sundance and premiered on PLV. But that film took us 13 years to make. And so over the course of 13 years, We were always working, not necessarily shooting, but editing. And over the course of that 13 years, I learned to make documentary, but I also learned how to use my time efficiently. And we were making multiple documentaries, many shorts. But the interesting thing is that when you make a documentary, right, you finish it quickly, 10 weeks, your skill set takes another turn. It's all, for us, it's always about the craft, right? So how do you learn to work certain scenes, use certain kinds of verite? How do you learn to use archival effectively? And so every time we got another project, instead of waiting the usual time period for a film is close to, a narrative film is 7 to 10 years, but for a documentary, it's 4.5. So we had 10 weeks or 12 weeks to go from beginning to end and to take a step up in our ability to control these parameters. And all of them are not necessarily having to do with tape or film or light. Some having to do with trust between you and your character. And I think doing a 12-year, 14-year verite shoot took us to a whole different level in terms of working with talent.
Yeah. And having to navigate that.
Yeah. What does that process for something that long, what does that process look like?
It was really sinking our teeth into the demands of what does observational filmmaking really require, both in terms of endurance, but also in terms of building trust. So I would say the biggest thing I think we learned along the way, because there was our family and our son, but we also highlighted the journey of another family and their son. And every year involved, building trust with them and then building trust with the schools that were involved in this storytelling process. And that doesn't happen overnight. It's something that happens with the cameras to the side. They don't involve cameras, actually. They involve dinners, drinks, coffee, spending time with people, listening to them, listening to their concerns, having, a response that considers their situation. And I think that has paid off for us in the long run in terms of the other projects that we're involved in, whether they're, observational driven or archival, because I think that skill set of building trust and understanding and listening it'll take you everywhere, really, even in the crew and the teams that we build and how we communicate with editors and other people either on set or offset in the post-production. Being able to be flexible, but also have a plan at the same time. Because with observational, you can't control people's lives and it's not scripted, but there's things that might be happening that you need to be flexible enough to move towards. I guess it's the Bruce Lee sort of be like water kind of thing,
Absolutely.
Be able to adapt and find that, this is more interesting than what I planned. Let me pivot, because I'll miss that if I don't. I do think that the relationship is inherently extractive. There is a power dynamic. You can change the name. It's not a subject anymore. They are not subjects. They are participants. They are collaborators. But ultimately, there is a power dynamic that one has to deal with, that you can certainly build trust, but I think there's even a limit to that in terms of what that equity can look like, what that equality can look like. And so it can be uncomfortable, it can be difficult. And so for me anyway, I'm finding a little bit more joy in this aspect of experimenting with the form that may or may not have collaborators involved, where we can have a little bit more sort of, or attempt to work with more control over the narrative and really be very upfront and transparent about where the limits are for the collaborator. With Going to Mars, the Nikki Giovanni Project, which is the Emmy-nominated film, people were kind of surprised that Nikki Giovanni, would say, I'm not going to answer that question, and we put it in film. But for us, in some ways, it's a breath of fresh air. I'd rather have clear boundaries from her saying, I'm not going there. You can do this, that, and whatever you want. I'm not going to get involved in your creativity, but I'm not answering this, and these questions, and you're not going to go there. Those limitations, in some ways, are a godsend for us because now we know what's the limits are, but we can now think about creatively, what can we do beyond that with the other stuff that we have? So we flip that.
Making film is a painful experience for participants, be it narrative or doc. And we've learned to negotiate that. We also know that if it's not painful, it's probably not going to be good. And so the question is, how much pain are they willing to tolerate? What kind of pain? Are those triggers acceptable? And so, I'm mentoring someone now, and I looked at a rough cut, and I kind of felt it didn't go anywhere. But now I have the pain of telling her this didn't go anywhere. But also the pain of knowing that these people haven't shared anything because they're in pain.
Right.
And can she or he take them there in a comfortable way, in a way in which they can recover? So when one says, no, I can't cross this boundary, find another way to tell the story. That's sometimes easier for us. And with more skill set, we find, okay, there was an old movie you were in 1924. You've discussed a similar sort of, and that's what we've moved to, and it's liberated us. But I don't think it's painless.
Right.
But I also think our films are more inspiring because once we get them through that, there's a journey that they keep sharing with their friends.
I'm sure it's a therapeutic experience to finally be able to, tell the story that they've lived. But in your shoes, it's a fine line to walk of, being too intrusive or not intrusive enough to tell that story accurately and respectfully.
And, and being intrusive for what, right?
Exactly.
And also, what is the purpose for the intrusion? We know of colleagues who spend a lot of time being intrusive because they think they're going to get something without that other time, without the camera, that has to do with building trust and trying to capture complexity and drama, of course, and tension without that cost in mind. So, and it's a fine line, like you say.
What other ways do you walk that line of, subjectivity versus objectivity?
One of the things that we've done is we've walked from a few projects. Well, ultimately, when it doesn't work, we've been able to say we can let it go. And that's hard because most filmmakers, particularly filmmakers, I'm not going to exclude the narrative folks, they're not making a lot of money. And it's like that we hear about the 1%, but most of us are struggling to pay the rent, particularly in New York. And what we found is that's a different kind of trust, right? We trust that we will survive, and we invested in community here, so there'll be another project. I know it's naive, and you can help me out, Michelle, if you think it's particular.
Well, I think in terms of there are a couple of things. There's subjectivity, objectivity. There's also is this just a feature promotion for you? Are we being brought on to promote you as a figure where there is no complexity and it's only the good side, and that's not the kind of stories we tell. So it's navigating all of those factors. And then I don't feel we're as respected as some of our more direct. And so it's almost like, yes, this is propaganda, or this is a promotional piece, and I need you to do this, that, and the other. And it's like, no, I'm an artist. First of all, I don't put myself in the journalism bucket because, well, for a number of reasons. Short storying is I really see I see myself as a storyteller. It doesn't, and that's platform agnostic. I will use nonfiction. I will use archive. I will use stylized stuff. I will, do recreations or do fictional elements that I feel will be the best to tell the story that I want to tell, which is partially how we got into VR as well. So it's nice to have that sort of recognition, because in some cases we find ourselves also teaching participants, what the complexity is of the documentary process, and convincing them too that it's not all just your good side. Otherwise, it's a flat film. You wouldn't want to watch it either. So you have to trust us to understand that we're going to tell a story that by the end of it, everybody's actually rooting for you because they've seen your vulnerability. They've seen your flaws, but they identify with them. They don't judge them. They identify with them. And that's our job as storytellers, to be able to take all those elements, have enough trust where people are opening up to it, and work with that in a way that's sort of transformative for audiences too. Because what better thing than to come out and say, gosh, I see myself in this. I am inspired to sort of rethink, my relationships, or how I show up in the world, and, this brings us to this notion of telling our own stories also, and having the control of that complexity. And so I think it's just as dangerous to work on story where it's just a positive that's shown, because then we're not real. Then we're not really human beings, whether it's the negative or the positive, right? So how do we break that mold?
You had made a point of a lot of people seem to be watching a lot more documentaries, the general public, I mean. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a lot more available than it used to be. From the time we started, I'm not sure what the factor is, but I'm sure it's old. It might be 10. I know the market is contracting, and it has been doing so, but still the numbers of stories we see now exponentially is greater than it was when we started. I also think it's less expensive and significantly. But the sexy thing is the narrative, and I think we're trying to do our best to erase that.
Yeah, I also think that social media and YouTube have really made this idea of I don't want to say reality TV, but reality storytelling, or storytelling that's direct, that's not necessarily a high production value. We are in people's lives. I think has made many generations much more open to watching documentary, and that's made it more accessible. And I think through that, the commercial entities have come in, that money can sort of be made out of it, and they've created a bubble that we're suffering from right now. The streamers are pushing the larger budgets to go, exclusively to true crime, celebrity, and cult. This is what one of our editors was talking about. It's the 3 C's: celebrity, cult, and true crime. Now sort of feeding this streamer ecosystem. But we're old enough to know a streamer world documentary had a sort of different purpose, and it's so it still exists, but I feel more and more under threat. The idea of, in the public interest, that nonfiction, should be available to people without necessarily the commercial interests dictating what stories should be told. And that's what we're sort of fighting.
In talking of your process, your pre-production process, that is, I know you do some storyboarding. You had sent us an example, and I thought the frames were amazing. What other kind of processes during pre-production do you do on your projects?
We do a lot of research. A lot of research. And the research isn't just limited to the particular story we're interested in. We're looking at if it's a particular period of a person's life or something we want to explore. We do all kinds of academic research. We bring it together. Sometimes we're reading fiction books, that are connected. So, and we bring all of that to how we tell the story. It may or may not, some of those elements may or may not end up in the final film, but they inform how we develop our point of view on how we're going to tell a particular story. So there's a lot of research. Definitely, that's part of that pre-production process.
We're into change. And it changes a lot easier, I said, than one might think, right? And the change really comes from the fact that a lot of the history that we've been taught is inaccurate. We spend a lot of time in history books. We spend a lot of time thinking about what if you're telling the story of Napoleon and you put in the Haitian Revolution. It's incomprehensible that you're telling the history of France or Napoleon and you don't address the one thing that really defined his success and failure. And so we see that all the time. And so if you look behind me, probably you'll see a lot of books on the floor. And so we don't have to scratch too deeply to find that, but that's what empowers people as well. And so for every story we want to tell, we know that someone's already lived it and experienced it in a meaningful way. So that's one level. We read a lot, but two, we interview a lot of people.
Great interview. Yeah, without the camera. Mm-hmm.
But I also think we have a process of interviewing that's consistent with our backgrounds. Michele is not an interrogator, but she is an attorney, and she takes lots of notes.
Yeah.
Interviews are very emotional. We push the interviewer to couch their experience in the stories and their lived experiences. You're an expert in the manufacture of basketball. They're constantly telling us stories. And then we tease out the emotional elements associated with those stories. Those become the threads for our film often. We go through a transformation when we're thinking about these films by examining what pains us and what we are made to deal with, and the questions that we would be nervous about asking, having to do with our race, our sexuality, our class. And so you will be surprised how many people are unwilling to examine those issues. And now you have a film that you're basically free to talk about issues that are impacting all of us.
There's definitely a healing process for us, because if we're not uncomfortable, then we're not really digging. That can lead to sort of interesting stories that are full of tension, but also, interpersonally sort of digging ways where we could possibly either transform ourselves or each other. But another thing more on the sort of creative aesthetic side is we often sort of will brainstorm around a particular project in pre-production. What are the creative constraints that we want to impose? We don't want any interviews in this, or it's going to be just voiceover, or it's all going to be archival, or the archival is going to be black and white. So we try to, after some research and thinking about the material that we have available, what is a creative aesthetic that we're going to constrain this into? What is a container that is going to push us creatively also in terms of voice and aesthetic? So that's very exciting to be able to do that and to see these as opportunities, not as obstacles to, a straightforward sort of traditional story. So sometimes we impose constraints on ourselves, like, we could take the easy way and make this just a chronological story because it has dramatic tension, but how can we mix it up and propose something? And this often happens in the pre-production and is, of course, re-explored in the edit, because sometimes it doesn't hold up. But we definitely want to take off with some creative constraints that can help us make decisions, make creative decisions. So there is a focus too in the process.
Now, you had mentioned you've worked with some VR. What about virtual reality kind of excites you for the future of filmmaking?
What excited us is to be able to tell a story in 3 dimensions and deal with some of those obstacles we talked about. The obstacle of like, where to use your attention focus. Initially for us, when we looked at VR, it was a medium that really gamers were using, and there was not a lot of emotion associated with.
Or story. It was really sort of an immersive experience without narrative sort of scaffolding.
So we basically decided to make a multi-part series looking at African American resilience in the course of 400 years of racial terror. As a big, and and it was a very powerful piece and affirming, but we couldn't raise the money to complete that.
Well, we did the first episode, and we use magical realist tools. Like for us, VR was the home for how we were envisioning it. We couldn't be able to do it on a 2D format, because it needed to be this immersive, magical realist thing that was sort of collapsing time in front of you.
So imagine this: you have an experience where someone is having a conversation, and 1776, and that same conversation continued in 1923, just to close chains, and back again to 1850. So we were able to accomplish that. And wow. It won a grand jury prize, multiple prizes at Tribeca, at Sundance, where we premiered it. But what did we take home from it? We took home the ability to play with time and space in the 2D world.
I think what we've drawn from it is a bit of a flip from your question, is that what are we bringing to the work we're doing now that comes from VR? And I feel it's completely changed the way we tell stories with our films. We very much spend a lot of intentional time around the immersive experience of our pieces, of our films. And what does that mean? It means in some ways we create a world. We attempt to create an aesthetic world where with particular rules of storytelling that really come from VR for us, where then people use as a reference point and then take off on this journey in documentary film. And I don't think we were approaching it that way before we did VR. And so it's opened up this whole new way of looking at material, both auditory too, being able to, in some cases, take advantage of that 5.1 surround sound, and how do you create the emotional sort of layering, but also how can you tell the story sonorically too that makes it feel immersive. And building worlds now is something we spend a lot of time with in our films.
So as you spoke, I'm thinking of virtual reality, but I'm also thinking about the Nikki Giovanni film, where you would be hard pressed to know where she is. She's in a space. She looks to her right, it's 1948, and to her left, it's 1978. That's where we brought the VR, but we're also doing something else. We are deeply connected with emotion. And so the question is, how do you feel at the beginning, middle, and end of the scene? And have we accomplished this? And if you can't see that, that's a line that goes up and down, and that with peaks and valleys. And that is what the combination of the skill set is. That is why we use mood boards. That is why we draw things out. That's why we do the research. But that's why we work with characters in advance to know what their triggers are, and to some extent get their permission to trigger them. And I think, is it manipulative? Yeah. We're trying to not take advantage of our clients, and sort of has a sort of a mutual manipulation. One of the things that we learned during American Promise, we shot a couple of days a month for 14 years. And our careers began to change. So 7 years in, when we realized we don't have a film, because kids really are not able to speak and express themselves in a way that that's working for this particular film. And we realized that we had to be involved, and we had to share. And some of the biggest emotional gyrations are particularly Michele, but me too. But that really changed our relationship with how we work with characters, because we were there. We are merchant peddlers with information, and that hopefully that does someone some good. We make the films for us and our families, and we hope by making films for us that other people will find them entertaining. We do not have to compromise, because we can go back to our day jobs, although that was be quite disappointing.
Yeah, compromise is a big thing. I mean, we started talking about independence and control, and how that led us in some ways to nonfiction, because the raising the money, but we still had some control and independence, and it's been our through line, throughout the process. You're always compromising in storytelling, but there's certain limits to that, and then, that then jeopardize the integrity of what you want to say, right? Or and somehow don't provoke, because you're just in some ways just feeding the same system, sometimes with different representation. So you're not sort of challenging. And we always want to challenge, whether it's from the creative side or the content side. It's one life to live. You want to make it count.
Absolutely.
and not necessarily succumb to compromise or regrets in that way. Yeah.
Now, if we have some time, you had sent us an editing outline. Could you kind of walk us through how you use that?
So that sample is a snapshot of a moment in our editing process. With Going to Mars, we did away with this idea of a 3-act structure, and we decided that what if the film itself was a poem with stanzas? And so we started to build these stanzas. I think we had about 6 of them that each had their own theme, their own container, their own sort of dramatic arc, and their own sort of elements that were actually repeated. But so we would then, we had scenes that were already created, and so we would play with them, and we'd represent them on the stick by stickies and figure out, well, how do we refine these stanzas with what we have? So that board is really all of the scenes that we had cut together, and then that we had already cut, and then figuring out how they fit from a poetry perspective. And so we would sometimes go back to the board instead of to the cut to see what we were feeling. And we use, color coding too, to represent different elements. Because in some ways, I'm realizing, or I know in terms of even we talk about our own aesthetic approach being sort of this Afro-Atlantic aesthetic approach, in terms of there is a rhythm to editing. There's a rhythm to what you see and how it repeats. That's almost, sonoric. So with the color coding, we can see how often it comes back and whether it makes sense, So if you don't see something for too long and it comes back, then we're sort of losing the rhythm of the story. So the Miro board helped us both create our stanzas and understand, sort of the titles of these stanzas on the board, and also figure out, well, what is the rhythm of the film without having to necessarily watch the whole thing.
Part of our process, it's almost every film. We don't bring out the boards early on, right? Our process is as really, if we have verite, we cut that first, and we call it the emotional glue. And that is a pretty commonly used process for us. And so what we found is that, at least with that particular film, we had these topics that we wanted to address, having to do with her life, the father, the revolutionary part of her life, New York City. On a larger scale, we often feel that the verite in these films, if it's all together, we lose structural importance and we use resonance. So the color codes were verite, archival, and interview. And what we noticed that we had too much white, we could see, and that was interview, we could see visual representation of what we were feeling. And so it was a tip-off that we needed more variability. And we found this way of roller coastering our audiences using a combination of those three and not going too long without diversity of content.
Yeah, some filmmakers and editors prefer to use like full transcripts, but I really like the visual representation, because you can really, in a snapshot, basically see your film in color and figure out how it's working in terms of priorities and rhythm.
I grew up kind of musically inclined. I used to read sheet music, and it reminded me of that. But it also reminded me, they say you can a lot of times hear music in color. And as soon as I saw your board, I was like, this has this melodic feel to it. And so it's very interesting that you're saying exactly what I was thinking. I was like, wow, that's so amazing.
That's something we're going to take home from this interview, because we believe strongly in the power of music to tell stories and to inspire. And sometimes it's not the typical musical cues that you'd be come to mind, but that was certainly in that board. And in fact, we have a lot of beautiful musical cues. People can get a sense of the story by the musical cues. And
irrespective of the musical cues, it is a bit like music. There's a rhythm that we're searching for, that should replicate. So yeah, there's sort of this other part of the brain working as we watch that. And I think that, and certainly for Going to Mars, we've had that reaction in terms of, and maybe it has to do with the rhythm, the patterns that we see, but also the cues too, that there is a level where the film hits you that is not verbal. It's an emotionality that's not verbal, that can't be necessarily articulated, but you feel it. And I think that's what music does. They also say that's what cinema should do. There's a book called Devotional Cinema that looks at the idea of, cinema having this devotional aspect that it has a purpose that's more than just the literal, a storytelling element, that it's hitting you at other levels like music does,
If you were able to go back and talk to yourself at the beginning of your career, what advice would you give yourself?
I would have done a really deep dive into editing. It's a skill set that I don't regret, but I would love to have had more skill set in it, because I realize that I actually have an editor's mind. Like, I'm really thinking about each cut and frame in collaboration with the editor. And I would love to, to have explored that skill set more. And that is, if we go back to what I was saying, it's the highest paid line item too. So it's a skill set that is quite treasured, but it's something that I'm working on actually right now. You're never too old to learn more on the edit end of things.
Absolutely not. And
So
Joe, how about yourself?
I'm not changing nothing. And that
That's okay too.
when you think about it, we've met great people over the years. We generally 80% like the people we work with, right? We develop filmmaker community. We've used the filmmaking skills to raise our families. Our kids are makers. We can pay our rent. I think the only thing I regret is not bringing more folks along with us. And that's what we're involved in now. We started a nonprofit where we are working with 5 makers a year. And we walk them through these pitfalls. And they're not just pitfalls, they're opportunities. We help them develop a growth mindset. We push the patients because not only wasn't Rome built in a day, but films aren't built in, 400. What we're finding is that what we've learned can help others, but more importantly, it allows us to make more change because more people will be making films that give us a different slice of what it feels like to be American, who put the history in context and can inspire future generations. And I know that's a lofty goal, and I feel silly sometimes talking about that, but when I'm dead and gone, it won't matter. I will have achieved this goal, and it's nice. This is a wonderful field full of pain and joy, and we've found our spot in a little part of Brooklyn.
Well, very beautifully said. Thank you so much to you both for the conversation. It's been very heartwarming, eye-opening, all of the above. So thank you so much for your time and talking with me today.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you for taking the time.
For more interviews or deep dives into the StudioBinder software, like and subscribe to be notified when new videos are added. I'm Brandon with StudioBinder Academy. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.